Hello everyone, and welcome to this tutorial. In this video, we are going to create an application in Xamarin.Forms that will allow us to communicate our C# to JavaScript in a web view, as well as to communicate our JavaScript in our web view to our C# code. So let's get started. I'm here in Visual Studio and I'm going to go and create a new project. In creating this new project, let's create a new Xamarin.Forms application. Hit Next. I'm just going to call this JS WebView, and I'm going to create. Okay, this is going to be a blank application, and I'm going to do Android, iOS, and Windows UWP. Okay. So first we're going to expand all of these, and we're going to put all of our web files in each project's assets or resources folder. So in Android, we can do that by adding a folder, and I'm just going to call this www because this will be the root. I'm going to paste this in iOS in our resources folder, and in our UWP, again, we can paste that in our assets folder. There we go. There's a certain file structure in which we're going to make. And of course we can start here in our Android project. Again, I'm going to add some folders. We can add a CSS folder if we wanted to. Maybe we can add some fonts if we wanted to. We won't use these, but what we will use is a JS folder, which will contain our JavaScript folder. And then in our root, we're going to add a new item. As I'm just going to open Notepad here, and I'm just going to save as. Now again, there's a couple different ways that we can achieve this, but just to make it very quick, I'm going to save this as a index.html, and this is going to contain our source, our HTML source. And I just drag this into the assets folder, and again we're going to create a JavaScript file. Actually, let's do that the other way that I did earlier. Just save as, and we can put. Now we can put it in here. I'm going to call this file init.js, just to make everything simple. And then we can go ahead and drag our init.js right in here into the project. Now these two are the only files that we're going to need. And we're going to copy this www folder again. Yes, we are, so that we can have it in our iOS. And again here, so we can have this in our UWP application. Fantastic. Now there are different ways in which we can, again, accomplish this task, but I'm going to leave it very basic, and we're going to start here in our Xamarin.Forms application. So in our main page, we're going to open up our main page.xaml, and we're going to delete everything here in the stack layout, so we can just have a blank view. Now, again, we can do this with Fresh MVM, we can do this with Prism, but just to keep everything simple and basic, I'm going to just create a new class, and I'm going to call this is going to be our view model, main page view model. Excellent. Now, in our main page XAML.cs file, underneath initialize component, we can add our binding context and make that equal to new main page view model so that we can connect our view model to our page. Excellent. We won't need this CS file anymore, so let's save it. Now in our main page XAML file, what we're going to do is we're going to add some basic code. So let's replace this stack layout with a grid. We're just going to create our HTML page. And we're going to add some grid definitions. So I'm just going to paste this so that you can see. And again, we're going to add a stack layout. Orientation is going to be horizontal. Now within this stack layout, we're going to have two buttons. The first button is going to be used to just execute our JavaScript in our web view, and then the second button is actually going to execute our JavaScript and then going to execute a C# command. So basically the first one is going to go from C# to JavaScript, and the second is going to go from C# to JavaScript and back to C#. So let's create these two buttons. Button, we're going to have text, and that's going to be equal, we're just going to call this eval JavaScript. Excellent. And they are going to have commands, but for now, let's just duplicate this back to C#. So this first button is going to be used to execute, to evaluate our JavaScript. The second is going to be used to execute our JavaScript and then come back to C#. Each button is going to have a command. So let's create these commands. Command, let's call this eval.js. And this one, let's call it, you guessed it, eval.js. How about 2? Actually, what I'm going to do first is change this so that we can have public, and this is obviously going to be bindable object to add our reference. Okay, let's add some space here, and I'm going to paste our command. Add reference to I commands. And here is our JS2. Now in here, we're going to write our command. This is what is going to be executed whenever we click on our button. But let's bind them up using a binding, and let's eval.js. Excellent. Let's copy and paste these binding commands. Don't forget, JS2. Back to our view model. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to actually create our custom web view. This custom web view is going to be used to execute our JavaScript. So I'm going to go over to here, add a new folder, name this controls, and we're going to only create one control. So let's just make this a class, and we're going to call this control custom web view, or whatever you want. Excellent. Now this is going to be public, and we're going to extend web view. And of course, we're going to need to add reference to Xamarin.Forms. Now we're going to create one property for this example. Again, you can create as many properties as you desire, but for this project, we're just going to create one property. The only property we're going to create, we're going to call it evaluate JavaScript. So it's going to be a public static bindable property. Evaluate JavaScript. property. Bindable property, let's create it. Again, we're just using some standard coding practices here. Name of, evaluate, JavaScript. If I can spell this correctly. Alright, let's create this property. This is going to be a public func, and it's going to have a string and task. Beautiful. Add reference to system threading. Again, I like to format my code every now and then. Let's continue writing our property. Custom web view, null, and binding mode dot one way to source. Excellent. We have created our property. Now here we need to return the value. So let's add some get sets. I'm just going to copy and paste because the code is pretty redundant, pretty standard. Again, since it's a property. Okay, very good. And that's all we have to create our custom web view in the Xamarin.Forms application. Now let's add the control to our page.xaml. Custom web view. Actually, we're going to have to locate that first. Okay, let's call this controls. CLR. Namespace. All the usual stuff. Now we can add it. Great. Grid.row equals 1. We're not going to create a source yet, but we're going to have a binding context to our evaluate JavaScript. Binding evaluate JavaScript. Mode. One way to source. Excellent. And let's just create some horizontal options. Actually, what I'm going to do here is just paste my code. so that you can easily see without any spelling errors. Good. Now if we go back to our view model, we're going to have to create our binding property for the evaluate JavaScript. And that is the code for that. We're going to add system threading. And now we're going to add a now we're going to customize our HTML files here in each of our projects. Now in order to do that, we're going to first create an interface that will basically get a base URL from each of our projects. Or we can actually just add it ourselves. base URL. That is our interface. Public interface. And it's only going to have one property, string get, which will basically get the reference to all of our HTML files that we place in each of our projects. So let's start with Android. So how can we connect our base URL to Android? What we're going to first create is a folder called Objects. This is just going to have all of our objects. If we add a new file, we can just add a simple JavaScript code file, and we're going to call it base URL. I'm going to copy this name because we're going to create that in our iOS project as well. Actually, because this file is blank, we can just copy our objects there. Now we have base URL there. And also in our UWP, we also need an objects folder with base URL. Okay, let's start with Android. So first what we're going to do, just add our using statements here, as well as our dependency. Now this is very important, because what this is going to be used is going to map our base URL object CS file to our main project in Xamarin.Forms. So whenever Xamarin.Forms calls this get command, it is going to go into each of our projects and call its individual get command based on whatever project you have loaded. Great. Let's start to create our project. Again, this is the Android version. And we're just going to quick add reference to our base URL using JS WebView.Android Android project.objects. Great. Alright, now let's create the class. Again, this is just going to be base URL. It's going to extend our base URL, so we can add reference to interface. And we can add our get command. And it's basically going to look just like that for each of our projects. Return Now I'm going to copy and paste this into our iOS. So, and also in our UWP, changing that to UWP. Again, you can see there's a little bit of redundant, but that just makes it easier to code, right? All right, now, where are we going to get our file directory for our web view and our HTML and JS code? Well, in Android, it's located in file, / Android asset, and that Android asset folder is this folder right here. So since our HTML file is located in the www folder, we can just add www. Now this is going to be our main, this is base URL, our main URL. Now, how about in our iOS project? Well, it's under resources, www. I said 4W, that's www. Well, in order to get access to our resources folder, we need to call, again, this is iOS, ns bundle, and of course we'll add reference to that. This is our main bundle, and then the bundle path. Now this bundle, this right here gets us access to this resources folder. So the next directory down is www. So we can just do that. Excellent. Now iOS is complete. Now for our UWP. Again, we're going to add reference to the assets folder and the www folder. And how to get there is, again, it's just going to be a string, and the code is ms appx web / and this right here is our main directory. So one folder down is going to be assets, and again www. All right, simple. So now we have the now we can gain access to all of our files and folders inside our www folder in each of our projects. Let's go up to main page view model and add some more code. Now our custom source, this is what we're going to need to do here is we have our custom web view, but we don't have any HTML inserted in it. It's just a blank page. And in fact, let's run our app in our UWP just to see what we get. Great, no errors. We have our buttons. They currently don't do anything right now. Now let's just run our Android project by setting it as the startup project. Look at the manifest, and let's just delete these uses SDKs. Alright, we are deploying and starting our Android application. And just like in our UWP, we have our JavaScript buttons. So we have our buttons. Great. Now in my view model, I'm just going to close all but this so that we can just have that. I'm going to remove and sort our usings. Now let's actually add some HTML. Now we're going to review two different ways of injecting our HTML. The first way we can use custom HTML, in which we can just write here in our view model. And in order to do that, I'm just going to create a private static string called custom HTML. Preface that with an @. Now in here we can write some custom HTML. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste some code. Great. Now this is going to be the skeleton HTML. Now notice in our script source we have js.initjs. This is going to be because we already have the reference for our www folder, this is our root. We have our JS, and within our JS we have our init.js, which there's nothing in it right now, but that's going to be where our source is. Again, we can have our file and folder structure any way we want, just as long as we make sure we keep everything within a certain hierarchy. The same within all of our projects. Now here we're going to add just a button. We're just going to call it evaluate C#. Now this is going to be a button within our web view. And when we click it, it's going to call a JavaScript function called eval C#, which is going to activate C# code. And this is called custom HTML. Okay, now to create a property called custom source. This is going to be of web view source, public web view source, and we're going to call it custom source. And we're going to add a get. Great. Now, the root for each of our projects, so we want access to this www folder. Well, how we do that is let's just create a var and call it root. Now we're going to utilize our base URL file that we created earlier in each of our projects, but in order to reference that, we're going to call dependency service.get base URL. Let's add a reference to that. Get. Now what this is going to do is this var, notice it's a string. Because if we call the get command within base URL, it's a string. Now what this does is this calls get in any of our Android projects, iOS projects, or UWP projects, and in this Android project, in this case, it is going to return this string because we're calling the get command out of our Android project. Now let's create a string and call it URL. And we're just going to write a string command. So root index.html. Excellent. So if we return URL, we're going to get something like this. If we call it within our Android project. And this is the direct reference to our html.index folder right here in our Android project. Again, in our iOS project, it would have a different link, and then it would still have our index.html. Very good. Now, because we need to return a web view source, there are two different types of sources that we can return. In our first case, we can return whatever HTML we write in our index.html folder, or we could actually return this custom HTML. And in order to do that, let's return new, and what we're going to use here is an HTML WebView source. Now notice the variables we put in here. For our HTML, we're going to pass in custom HTML, and we're going to need a base URL. And guess what that is going to be? Root. We need base URL because notice in here we are referencing init.js. Well, we need this root right here in order to have all of our file and folder hierarchies being able to be referenced within our custom HTML. If we didn't have a root and we called init.js, that file would be not available. So this is the first way to do it. By loading, let's just comment here, load custom HTML. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out, and let's do second way. So, or what we can do is load local HTML file. And in order to do that, let's return, instead of a new HTML WebView source, we're going to return a URL WebView source. Now these are all WebView sources, so when we return this, we will still have a WebView source. But in here, we're going to only have one property. And what that is going to be is our URL. And we're going to set that equal to our URL that we created up here. That's it. So again, we could use either this method, which will just return any custom HTML that we want to load, or we could load the URL. Index.html, which is basically, instead of loading this custom HTML in our Xamarin.Forms app, we will be loading the individual HTML files in each of our projects, such as the one here in UWP or iOS, but right now there's nothing in there. We're going to stick with this method because I like to have the HTML files individually in each of the projects. But again, you could also use this method, which is using this HTML right here. Great. Now, what I'm going to do is go into each of the HTML files here in our Android, iOS, and UWP, paste some HTML. This is the exact HTML that was used here in our view model. I'm going to copy and paste that HTML in our iOS. Save, and as well as the HTML file in the UWP project. Great. Okay. So, our view model is basically finished. The only thing we have left to do is have our commands being executed. But before we execute our commands, we need to create our JavaScript files. We have 3 of them to make. Now, this is where it gets a little complicated. Each project, or rather, each Android, iOS, and UWP have different ways of injecting JavaScript into the web view and having it accessible to the C#, and again C# into the JavaScript. So this is where we're going to need to spend a little bit of time in each of the projects. And how I'm going to tackle it is I'm going to first do Android, then do iOS, and then UWP. So first, let's work with Android. So what we're going to need is opening of our init.js, and we're going to need to create 3 custom classes. But the most important class we're going to make is a renderer. We're going to create 3 custom renderers in each of our projects. And actually, I'm going to just copy and paste these renderer folders in each of our projects so that we can reference them later. Great. So right now, as I said, we are only working in our Android project. We have our init.js, and we're going to create a new renderer. So let's add a custom code file, and let's call this custom WebView renderer. Now this file is going to be named the same, so I'm just going to paste the files here in our individual folders. Again, back up to the Android folder. Alright, now the code here that's required is quite extensive, so I'm going to mostly be doing some copy and paste, but if you follow along, I will explain what each of the files mean. Okay? Great. Now, let's start creating the code for the Android. So, here's what we need to do. We need to we need to add this line of code, export renderer. Now, what export renderer does is it will take our custom web view, which is in here, in our Xamarin.Forms application. It will take our custom web view, and whenever it sees that custom web view, it is going to translate it, it's going to export it as this file here. So what do I mean by that exactly? Well, let's make our namespace, and let's actually make our class so that we can explain it a little better. ViewRenderer, iWebViewDelegate. Now this is very, very, very important. This iWebViewDelegate. So let's just implement the interface right away. And you may see this obsolete error, and all that basically means is we just need a constructor. And that constructor needs to take in context. So let's just write that now. Public custom WebViewRenderer context, and let's pass that back to the main WebViewRenderer. There. Okay. Oh, I seem to have added the wrong reference to context. Make sure it's Android content. Okay, so this is going to be our skeleton file for creating our renderer. So what this is going to do is it's going to export this class, and it's going to use this class whenever it sees custom web view up here in the Xamarin.Forms app. So instead of using WebView, it's going to use a custom WebView, which is going to have our JavaScript property mapped onto it. So let's go and create that. Now we're not going to look at these yet, but these are very, very important, and which uses the iWebView delegate. This is very, very important to make sure that we are loading the HTML from our Xamarin.Forms application. Now there's only one override that we need to make sure we override, and that is going to be onElementChanged. Override onElementChanged. And we're going to write some code. So we're going to look for 3 different types. If control equals null, if e.oldElement equals null, and then e.newElement equals null. Now, if control equals null, now if we write control and we highlight over it, we see that it's of type WebView. So our control will represent the main WebView. Now, in some cases, the control is null, but this is important because it will always be null the first time onElementChanged is executed. And in this if statement, all we need to write is this code. Now, in order to get access to our context here, let's just make sure we have that in our constructor. And all I'll do is just create a global property and call it context, and just set the context equal to the context passed through. Now, all this is saying is we just need a new Android web view. And in iOS, we will make a new iOS WebView, UWP, new WP WebView. Set native control is Xamarin.Forms' way of passing this new WebView and setting it as control. So if control equals null, what it's going to do is make a new WebView and set control equal to that WebView. So now we have our new WebView. Now here's where it gets a little complicated. The evaluate JavaScript property right here, we're going to need access to that in our WebViewRenderer in Android. So we can use that by oldElement. So if we do oldElement, old WebView rather, notice we can have access to our evaluate JavaScript property that we had in our custom view. Well, if it's the old element, we're going to want to set this equal to null. But here is where we're going to have to write a lot of code here, is in this section. Because if our new element has been returned, we're going to want to set some settings. So let's set new web view, evaluate JavaScript. going to make an async method. With our JS. Great. Now everything we need to encapsulate, it will be executed in here. So the first thing we want to do is we could write something like this. Control, check if it's equal to null, evaluate JavaScript, and then have it evaluate something. But notice it takes a script and then a resulting callback. So we need a JavaScript callback. So before we do that, what I'm going to do is just paste this code. This is going to be used for our callback. Again, we're just adding this to make the setup very easy for future applications if we want to incorporate any of this in future applications. Now we're going to take this line of code and we're going to invoke it on the main thread. So device, main thread, right? Okay, very good. And our code is going to be in here, so we can just paste that in here. Now, if the build version is KitKat or more, we can invoke this evaluate JavaScript. If it is less than KitKat, we need to call load URL. So in order to do that, let's just have an if-else statement. Okay? If that, else that, okay. Again, let's just add that. Now I'm just going to do a debug write line so that we can see whenever we call evaluate JavaScript, the C# function is sending this JavaScript. Great. Now right below this code, I'm going to paste in this task. This is our response, if there is a response. In our case, we're not going to have any response, but it's just good to see how we can do it. I'm going to replace this with this code, and then I'm going to replace load URL with this code. Again, add reference to our JavaScript callback, and rather that's going to be a class that we're going to create, so let's generate the class. And actually, I don't want to put the class there, so I'm just going to copy the code. I'm going to delete this file because I just want to paste it right here in our namespace. Add reference to iValue callback. And I'm going to paste the class that I had already written. All right, here we go. Great. because we need to return a value, I'm just going to return response, which in most cases will just be an empty string. Alright, most of the main code has been written here for our renderer in Android. Now we need to set up our control. So in order to set up our control, what we're going to do is right above so we're going to have 4 if statements. And in here we're going to say if the control and the new element is available, then we're just going to set up our control here. Now here are some main settings that we need to set up. We need to enable JavaScript in our settings and control. A good idea is to have the DOM storage enabled, and we can do other various settings, such as vertical scroll bars, cache mode, web view settings high, as well as setting layer types, hardware and software, depending if it's KitKat or higher. Now these we don't need in order to make this work. But here's what we do need. We're going to need a custom WebView client, or we're going to need a WebView client and a JavaScript interface. Those are the 3 classes that we need to create in our Android. So let's do that in our objects folder. Let's add a new item. And let's just call this custom JavaScript interface. Add another one. We're going to call this custom WebView client. Alright, now we're going to need to write these. Now, we're going to set them here. Control.setWebViewClient new. For now, we'll just add a new WebView client. The second thing, set WebView Chrome client. And finally, we're going to add the JavaScript interface. And for now, let's just set this to null. But in all of our projects, we're going to call our JavaScript interface custom JavaScript. And you can see when we move on in the project where this name is going to be used. We're going to be using this name in our JS files. Great. Now, our custom JavaScript interface is going to be very simple. Okay, we're just going to add some code here. Let's add a constructor. Custom JavaScript interface. let's put that in a class. Now, in some cases, in some versions, you may want iRunnable. And all that is we can just create a void run that does nothing. Okay? Now here is where we call our JavaScript interface. Okay? I'm going to paste this code here. And I'm going to add references so that we can use these. Now, what export means is it's going to export this function so that we can use it in our JavaScript. And JavaScript interface means that we're going to be able to call it from the JavaScript. So notify is this is basically going to be our JavaScript function. Notify. And we can call that whatever we want. But here's something important to remember. String, it must be Java-Lang string. It cannot be of type string. It cannot be system string. In Android, it must be Java-Lang script. So we're just going to make one of these in each of our projects, in our iOS and our UWP. And we can make as many of these as we want. We can make another one, we can call it something else. We can have it of type int, right? We can have it return, right, 24, 23, right? We can have anything that we want. We can make as many as we want. So, that's basically it for our JavaScript interface. If we go into our web view, we can now say new JavaScript new custom. Or actually, if we go into our JavaScript interface, custom JavaScript interface, let's just copy it. And then we can add reference to our objects. Great. Now, one thing we can also do is we can also pass in the renderer. And if we want to do that, then we can come up here into our JavaScript interface and just change our constructor to something like this. So that now we have access to our custom WebViewRenderer just in case we needed to do something with it. Great. Our renderer is almost complete. And then we can take a look at our finished Android project. Next, we need to add a WebView client. I already added a custom WebView client here. And what I'm going to do is just copy and paste the entire code. So here's just the constructor with nothing in it. If you want to override URL loading, you can do so here. You can take a look at some documentations or tutorials or examples on how you would implement the should override URL loading. But what we're interested in is eval.js and the on-page loading. Now, this custom WebView client is used for loading the page of loading any link, anything. So here's a custom function that I wrote, eval.js. And these are not this whole thing is not really necessary for this project, but basically what it will do is whenever the web view is finished loading, it's going to evaluate this JavaScript. So, in other words, in JavaScript, I can write this JavaScript alert, right, and just say on page finished. Called from on page finished. So what this will do is whenever the web view is finished loading, it will make an alert, a pop-up alert, and will say called from on page finished. Coming back to our renderer, let's just set that up. Custom web view client. And we should be all set to go. Now, one other thing we need to do before we run our project is we need to make sure that the source, the HTML source, and the HTML page that we load is actually loaded into this new web view. Because we set native control, we now have a new web view. It's no longer using the web view that we passed through the Xamarin.Forms. So basically what that means is all we have to do if element.source is null, which it will be, we're going to load this. Now, if we look at the load, notice it takes an iWebViewDelegate. Well, that's why we needed this, the iWebViewDelegate. And if we remember, we have these functions down here at the bottom. And for those, all we're going to do is if it's a URL, in other words, if our source is a URL, right? Remember, here we had URL web view source. This is in our main page view model. We have URL source, and we also had an HTML web view source. Well, that's what we need to write in here. If it's a URL, we just load the URL. And if it's an HTML, I'm just going to paste this code right here. Basically, it's saying if there's a base URL we passed through, which we did, to use that. If not, then to just use that. It's just kind of a fail-safe to use this null. And there we have it. We now have our custom web view renderer completed. Now, here's one thing we need to do in order to have our exports work, such as that one that we used in our JavaScript interface. In order to have these work, we must come into references. We must add a reference to mono.android.export. That's very necessary. We must do that. Great. Now, there's no JavaScript being called yet, because in our custom, or in our main page view model, we don't have any commands being executed. We need to write some commands to hook up to our buttons. Likewise, same thing in our HTML file. We have nothing in our init.js, and we do need to create a function eval C#. As you can see, there's nothing in our JS file. But what we do have that we can see is in our JavaScript, in our Java's custom web view client, whenever the page is finished loading, it's going to call an alert. So let's see this in action. And again, I'm just showing this just to show that you can have JavaScript being executed in a WebView client. Maybe you would like to override the URL loading so that if it does load a URL, it will execute some JavaScript. Or you can even use jQuery. As you can see, there's nothing here, and we will need to fix that. By going up here into our main page, we need to make sure that we pass in our source. That was one thing that I forgot to do. So source, binding, custom source. So it was just launching a blank web view, but now that we have some source in there, hopefully we will see this dialog, as well as a button, because if you remember in our HTML file, we did have a button, but it's not going to do anything because we don't have this JavaScript function set up just yet. So let's run it again. Great. Here's our alert dialog box, called from on-page finished. And here's our HTML. So this is going to be the setup for all three of our projects. We're going to eval JavaScript. So this top bar is going to be called, this is our C#, called from C#. So if we click this button, we want to activate a JavaScript function. And if we click this button, we want to activate a JavaScript function that will activate a C# function. Likewise, this is our C# button, so that this is our JavaScript HTML button. So if we click this, it will run a JavaScript that will run a C# command. Great. So we have the setup, and everything seems to be working just fine. But because we don't want to call the alert, or actually we can just leave this the way it is. Great. So we have everything set up. The only thing we need to do is write our JavaScript functions, and we will write two JavaScript functions, and they will be calling these commands. So the JavaScript functions are going to be very, very simple. Function eval C#. Now, if you remember, in our JavaScript interface, we have a function called notify, and we want to call this function from our JavaScript. If you also remember, in our renderer, we called the interface custom JavaScript. So we want to make sure we use both of those. So custom JavaScript .notify. And let's pass in a string, because if you remember, the notify function did have a string in our custom script interface. string. And let's just write in complete. Great. Now let's call a function with 2 parameters. And all I'm just going to do is just that. Same thing, except with args. So we can have as many arguments as we want in our JavaScript function and pass it all through to our notify. And what we could do, if we wanted to, is we can have it do 2 arguments, right? We can have it go like this. JavaScript result 2, right? And in our JavaScript, we can just send those 2 just like that. But just because we're going to make this very simple, we can just leave it just like that. Great. So now let's hook these up to our command in our view model here. So in order to do that, our first command is going to execute this first command here. Or rather, actually let's make our first command give us an alert. Why not? So let's return, we need to return, let's do var result, await, and we're going to await evaluate JavaScript, alert, and let's have it return document element outer HTML. Great. So our first command, if I open up this and I just click on the app, just to show you, we're doing this button right here. So if we click this, what we want to do is have an alert box come up, which will show us the HTML. Now, the second one, let's utilize the one with 2. Let's call this JavaScript command with 2 arguments. So how can we call this from our C#? Well, I'm just going to paste the code. Again, we call evaluate JavaScript, and this comes from our view model right here. And here we have the function name that we used right in here. And here's how we can pass in the arguments into that function. Great. Now we are all set up. We now have our eval C# function, which when we click the button, it will output, it will send a notification with a string complete, which all that will do is just have a result show as complete. Okay, now we are completely finished with Android and its way of, now we don't need this project anymore, so I'm just going to shrink that down. But it would be nice to take to take a quick look at how we did the WebViewRenderer. So what was very important is we needed the WebViewRenderer. We needed just a view renderer with the iWebViewDelegate, as well as setting these properties here. And we definitely needed the WebView Chrome client. Okay, now I'm just going to close all but this, and I'm going to run it. Next, I will speed through some of the process of doing the iOS and the UWP because it is a little bit redundant, but just a little bit different. So here we are. It should show our alert dialog box that come up when our on-page finished was executed through our JavaScript interface. So we click OK. The rest of it loads. Now if we click, now pay attention to the screen, to the output down here at the bottom. If we click Evaluate JavaScript, yes, we get our alert dialog box. Great. How about Evaluate JavaScript back to C#? Again, that worked. If we look at our output here on the bottom, we see it was the JavaScript. We see the C# function sending that JavaScript, and then that JavaScript calling the C# function. And last but not least, calling the C# from JavaScript, it worked because down here we see complete. So there you have it. How to create the web view using JavaScript to connect to your C# or using your C# to connect to JavaScript. Now, let's do the iOS version. The iOS version, we're going to need a couple different files, and there's actually two different ways that we can do it. But first, let's create our renderer. So, down here in our renderers, we do have a custom renderer. And I'm just going to copy and paste some code and add the references. And again, the only one that we need to override is onElementChanged. And then we're just going to have a setup control just like we did in Android. Great. Now here we're just going to only use two if statements. The first one is using our new element. And then again, if both the native view and the new element are available, we're going to run the setup control. Now in iOS, it's called native view. And in Android, it's called control. So it's just good to remember that. We do still have access to element if we wanted to use it, but just to remember, set up control by checking the native view. Great. Now we're going to need a couple different things. We're going to need a WebViewDelegate. That's the first thing that the first one that we're going to do is create a WebViewDelegate. This is the first way that we can do it. There's two ways, one without using the delegate, but let me show you the one using the WebViewDelegate. Oops. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste my WebViewDelegate that I had already made. And just show you what that is. Okay? All right. Add our references. Okay, great. Now this is the code needed. And if this looks familiar, that is because it is the same as our Android script interface, or I'm sorry, WebView client, where we have the on-page finished, and we have that JavaScript. Now I'm just going to call our alert, just like we did. So that when our page is finished loading, we can call the alert. Now here's where we need to check. It's very strange, but whenever we execute JavaScript, one way that we can do it in iOS is have it look like this. Go into our JavaScript file. Here's our eval C# that we have used in our HTML, but notice we're using window.location. And here this can be anything, but I would rather it not be http:// because that looks like a real web address. So you can use any syntax here. Custom can be anything, and it's just it's just a simple link that doesn't go anywhere. But just to show that you can send this information back to C#, we must use window.location. And what that'll say is if we call window.location, what that's going to do is it's going to immediately should start load. And the result, or I'm sorry, the request is this right here. So we could write a real address if we wanted to, but in this case we want custom text to come back. So I just have a simple if statement. If it starts with that, return false. In other words, don't go anywhere. And if it's any other, then return true. So that's one way to do it. This way I thought was not so convenient because I kind of wanted to do it in a way like Android did it, where you would just have, you know, something like this, for example. Custom JavaScript notify. And again, I just pasted this into my iOS init.js. So this is the first way, and this is the second way. But in order to have our custom, a custom script exporter, we need to add a couple more files to our project. The first thing we need is a custom script exporter. And we'll just create that in our objects folder right here in our iOS. We will just add a new class, and we will call this class custom JavaScript export. Now again, this is iOS only. Let's make this public. Now our exporter, it has to extend NS object, and this one's also very important. We need to implement a certain interface actually first, and let's make that interface in our interfaces folder. Let's make a new folder, call it interfaces. Great. Now let's make a new interface. Now the way in which we write this interface is going to be very unique. I'm just going to call this custom JavaScript visible protocol. And it's going to implement JS export. This is very important to have that there. Public. Actually, we need to make this interface. And here is where we call notify. So if you remember in our JavaScript interface, we have this code. Well, it's going to be a little similar when we write it in iOS. First we need to do is preface our interface with protocol. Protocol. This is also very important for exporting the interface to use with our JavaScript. Void notify, and string.result. Excellent. Now here's something interesting to take a look at. If we didn't have any argument, export notify. So if we just had this, it would be correct. But if you remember, we want to pass in a string. We want to pass in a string. Now this would not work. If we have an argument, for some reason, we have to add a colon. This tells the exporter that our notify function has one result, right? Is going to have one string result. Now, here's something cool to look at. So let's just see a couple different versions of that. Notify 1, right? Here's without an argument. Notify 1, yeah. If we have one argument, we have to have this. But what if we have 2 and 3 arguments? Well, interestingly, it's going to look something like this. We would have to export another colon. So maybe we could export this as notify 3 argument 2, followed by another colon. So we need 1 colon for each argument, which is a little strange to understand, but if you just remember that, you can kind of start to create your own functions. Now, really quick, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the JS. Okay. Now, looking at our protocol, let's just say we wanted to call this notify2 function with 2 arguments. It would look something like this. You would call notify, but you would not add the colons. It would look like that. So basically, this notify3 R2 becomes that. But we still need these colons. It's very strange to understand at first, but let's just stick with one argument with one colon, and we could be all set to go. Great. Now the exporter. So we have our protocol, but we also need something like this. This is going to be our object, and it needs to also needs to implement our interface, organize the usings. Good, good. How does our custom view exporter look? Or how does our custom view renderer look? Well, since I'm doing the same functions in each of the apps, I'm just going to paste my code. Custom WebView delegate. That was our delegate that we created earlier. Now for our setup control, what we're going to do is add this, just to make sure that everything fits. Okay. Now, as of right now, the only thing that's going to happen is in our JS is this is going to work, and our pop-up our alert dialog is going to work. In order to make our custom JavaScript notify work, we're going to need to add these lines of code in our setup control. Again, the only thing that's probably going to change for you is this right here. This name right here represents this name right here. And so now we're all set. Now let's run our iOS application. I'm going to drag my iOS application here. And here we have our buttons. They do work. However, what we forgot to do, if we go to Properties, iOS Build, we need a small argument here. We're going to need one additional mTouch argument, and that's that. We need this in order to use our custom JavaScript exporter. In other words, this way, in order to use this way, we need that. If we just wanted to use this, then we don't need that. Great. I'm going to close everything but our renderers. Okay. So we have our Android renderer and our iOS renderer. Now let's run it again, and we should, this time, we should see our JavaScript. Alright, there you have it. It executed from the on-page finished. So if we evaluate the JavaScript, we see we get that is working. Again, execute JavaScript and then back to C#. Great. And then if we execute our JavaScript, we do see it did work down here. So now everything here in iOS works. All of our buttons work. Now I'm going to speed my way through Windows. because again, it's just about the same. There is one other thing we need to do for Windows, because there are two different ways that we can do it. Now, the first way we could do it, let's actually open up our JS file for UWP and paste this code. Now notice the difference. Windows external notify. This notify is actually not connected to any function we have. It's just standard for Windows. However, this notify here is part of this JavaScript interface which we're going to create, but it must be prefaced with window. That's the difference, is it must be window, and then here we add this command. Same function titles. Okay? So now that our JS is complete for UWP, we're just going to need to create first a runtime component in order to use this method. So to do that, let's right click on our solution, add, new project, runtime component for Windows Universal, next, and I'm just going to call this custom JavaScript runtime component, and hit create, and hit OK. As you can see, it shows up here at the top. We're going to name our class. I'm just going to call it HTML Communicator. And just yes. Okay. And it's very simple for what we need to add here. On top of our sealed class, we just want to add the allow for web. And remove and sort our usings. And here's where we're going to create our notify function. Now, you saw in our other projects, we created our notify within our individual projects, but in this case, we need to have a runtime component. So, let's build this runtime component. It should build pretty quickly, and then we will add a reference to our runtime component. Excellent. Now let's write the renderer. This renderer is fairly simple. Again, I'm just going to copy and paste some of the code. Just like we did last couple projects. All right. And we want to add references. Custom WebViewRenderer, JS WebView. All right, let's add the class. Great. Now we do need access to our HTML Communicator runtime component, so I'm just going to create a private read-only here at the top, so that we can have access to our communicator. Great. Now, just like before, we need to override on element changed, so this doesn't change. And then we're also going to add a setup control, just like we did in all of our other projects, just to set up some basic settings. element change, we're going to add 3 if statements. Okay. Great. Let's move that outside. Okay. And then we're going to add this final if statement to set up our control with any settings that we want. Now in here we just want to set it to null, the evaluate JavaScript, which again is from our custom web view in our Xamarin.Forms app. And a very, very simple evaluate JavaScript function here, which looks something like that. So the key is right here. Invoke script async. Okay, great. Let's continue. Let's remove and sort the usings. It doesn't look like our communicator is set up correctly. Let's just make sure that everything is correct. Custom WebViewRenderer, that is correct. And let's just move that down here. That was my accident. Move that down here. So now we have access to our communicator. Okay, great. The bulk of it is complete. Now, what we're going to do is in our setup controls, we're going to allow JavaScript. And then what we're going to do is create two different Okay, now what we're going to do next is create two different functions here. We're going to utilize the navigation starting, and then we're going to be using the script notify. Now, the script notify, this is going to be in charge for looking out for this one when we use the Windows external notify. This one down here, the navigation starting, we're going to use to gain access to our custom runtime component function using the injected custom JavaScript. So again, we have two different ways of doing it. We can use either or, but for now, let's just create our methods. Okay. All right. Now it's very simple for our script notify. We're just going to return the e.value. The e.value is literally whatever is inside here. So it's just going to return complete, whatever we put in here. Now for our navigation string starting, here is where we need to add our custom object, our web object. And it's just a one-liner, very easy. Add web allowed object. And here is where we put the name that we will be using here. Again, this could be any name. And we put our communicator, our HTML communicator, which was our custom JavaScript runtime component. Alright, let's add WebView. I do believe this is just going to be a Xamarin.Forms WebView. Great. Okay. We're all set with Windows. That was very easy. I like Windows. I only needed one class, one runtime component. I really do feel like Windows was the easiest. Android, probably about the same as iOS. But iOS I felt like was just a little confusing. As, well, as always. Okay, I'm back here in the UWP renderer. I just wanted to say I did something a little bit different. I added a couple lines of code here just to make sure that the alert pop-up dialog boxes were working with our new renderer. And what I did was, in my JavaScript, I just prefixed my notify with fx, just something that I can use in my renderer. And so, if my notify does not contain the appx, such as here in my view model, my execute JavaScript is not prefaced with appx, then I will just show a message dialog with the result. And in order to do that, I just created a new navigation complete, and it's shown here, and I just added this command. So hopefully you've learned something or had taken away something from how to build this template. I will post the code on GitHub. I will post the project on GitHub so that you can see. Again, let's just conclude here with viewing each one. So we'll take a look at Android. Okay, great. It's loaded up. Here we have our initial call. Here is our evaluating JavaScript. Evaluating JavaScript back to C#. We see they are working here in the output. Down here. And then our evaluating from the JavaScript web view. Great. Now back to iOS. Great. Great. Great, it's working in our output. Same here. Great. And finally, our UWP application. Great. Great, here in the output, and here in the output. Great. Well, I hope you learned something from this video, and thank you very much.